upon them. Yes, they want to lash out, but first they want to stop the shooting. Two claims from opening government. First, that this increases chances of survival for people within losing sides and sides which are overpowered. And secondly, how this creates a good geopolitical signaling effect from the West, which allows them to be more effective in dealing in these conflicts more generally. First argument then, on how the highest chances of survival and rebuilding exist on our side of the house. When you use things like missile defense systems, you use things like different sorts of weaponry which can detect landmines and stuff which is being laid out to try to attack you, as opposed to just shipping like drones and guns and stuff like this. This is the comparative. The first reason why you're more likely to survive is that it is inherently defensive as opposed to offensive, which means that you remove threats which are often in civilian areas. For instance, you have missile defense systems in large towns which prevent you from being bombed, which prevent other planes from flying over you and destroying your city. We've noticed that you don't use defense on the front lines because up there you just have to attack, maybe use it to a small degree, but often at the front you need to try to push forward, or you need to try to prevent future attacks preemptively, which means that this is often concentrated in areas where you're most likely to be hit, or you're most likely to be targeted. We think that therefore you're able to prevent or dissuade attacks on civilian areas by the fact that sides that are trying to crack down on you, that are trying to drop like bombs on you, are more likely to just lose their planes and are going to lose the essential sorts of equipment which they otherwise would not have lost because it was seen as an easy target in the absence of defensive systems. This means that because they want to win the war, they have to prioritize putting their strongest weaponry towards the front line and towards areas where there are actually battlegrounds, but that allows you to win. The second reason why this equipment is better is that it is harder to lose and damage. The reason for this is because there is no particular point in emphasizing capturing this technology if you are on a invading side or a larger side. And the reason for this is because it cannot be weaponized against you, and it is not something which is going to actively harm you unless you infringe on that territory. Compare this with trying to capture things like large rocket launcher systems, which are actively destroying people on your side of a conflict. We think that this creates an enormous strategic impetus with limited resources and time to try to get more offensive weaponry quicker. So we think that ours is more sustainable. The third reason is that when defensive weaponry is placed in a position, it becomes a natural gathering ground for military and different personnel to go towards. The reason is just because they are safer there. You can have things like field hospitals, which are more safe than if they were an area without a defensive bit of weaponry. As a result, then, when there's more centralized community centers there, it is less likely they're going to be targeted because it can be easily construed as just a war crime, which we think is massively harmful because you've already made it out very clearly that these sorts of places are gathering grounds which are highly defended. Why is this important then? Firstly, most people, or all people within wars, did not consent to being into this war in the vast majority of instances. Notice that weaker nations do not invade larger nations. The reason for this is because it's suicide. You're going to get destroyed. Iraq did not invade the United States. It was the other way around. We did not see Ukraine invade Russia. It was the other way around. This is the way that it occurs in the vast majority of instances. The implication of this is that this was a defensive action in the vast majority of cases. There's no impetus for you to want to be fighting in this conflict in the first place, which means that more than having revenge or more than trying to do something active in that warfare, you just want to survive this warfare. We grant this wish better on our side of the house. The second reason why this is good is keeping civilians alive is prior to rebuilding following a conflict, which is that you need to get your industries back on track, and you can only do that if you have workers. You can only get people who are able to heal and come together if they are still alive. Before we move on to the second argument on geopolitical signaling, closing opposition.
Which is true. Is it true that you're very able to destroy their weaponry, or is it true that the invader doesn't care about this because you're not as effective and don't pose as much of a threat to them? This is a contradiction.
I don't quite understand what the contradiction is. It's that you're I kind of missed the beginning of the sentence. But what I can piece out from it is that you're trying to sorry, I didn't understand. Sorry, clarify with Martha. Second argument on geopolitical signaling, which is that the West isn't involved currently because they were not invaded, and as such there is no impetus for them to have to go into this conflict in the first place. There's no reason why the United States should be in a country that's getting invaded. There's no reason why Britain should be there. It's not, they don't seem to obviously have skin in the game. As a result, they must justify the fact that they have intervened. Our claim is that sending weaponry there, which is offensive weaponry, is a sign of escalation. It is a sign you are actively trying to attack the country you've initially invaded. We think it's just trivially true because, like, if you're giving them guns, even if you're not firing the shot, you're loading the trigger, and that's something which is likely internalized and like as a message within people who are at the higher ups of decision making within these sorts of militaries. Notice this makes foreign governments angry. The comparative for us is that if we're sending defensive weaponry, we are justifying it as we are trying to save civilian lives. We're not trying to take yours. We're trying to do something equivalent to giving food aid, which allows people to survive in these conflicts, which under every like international agreement is like quite fine, right? And under like most of an intuitive like framework of you're just trying to save lives of people who are being harmed, we think that's okay. You can send food packages to Gaza without attacking Israel, right? Like that's the intuition here. We think that you're able to justify it by saying you would help the other country who are larger if the shoe was on the other foot. If they were being invaded, you do the same for them. The effects of this signaling of sending out offensive weaponry are threefold. Firstly, you won't be seen as neutral, and as such, you're less likely to be involved in things like peace talks, both during and after wars, reconciliation commissions, and things like this, because you cannot seriously be seen as neutral when you are literally firing weapons at one side within the war. This is bad because the West are often good at resolving these sorts of conflicts for three reasons. Firstly, they have economic leverage in many areas of the world, and as such are able to use this to force sides to the table. Secondly, there were former interactions and like institutional knowledge in ending conflicts, which comes from like ending the Cold War, ending World War II and other major conflicts which we mediated through the West. Thirdly, they have access to strong institutions like the ICC, and we think that you're able to you dissolve the interaction with these on their side of the house, which is very bad. On our side, you don't do it because they're seen as more neutral. Second reason for why it's bad is that nations are likely to block Western aid because it's seen as actively attacking them. This is like you don't stop food, you stop food aid coming in because they're actively firing weapons at you, and so you're able to easily make it out that this is a hostile foreign power and will not allow these sorts of shipments to go into the area as opposed to them being humanitarian aid. The third reason is that why it's bad is that it's harder to domestically justify funding, giving like aid to these conflicts within like the United States or a country like this if it is that you're sending offensive weaponry. Because offensive weaponry is killing people actively, whereas defensive weaponry is like destroying their machinery. As a result, then we think that given that you're less likely to get this like this localized support from within these Western states, you're less likely to be able to get the support which we think saves people's lives, magnifying all the first argument. For all these reasons, opening government. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this fine speech. Are we recording, by the way? Cool. So now I'd like to invite the leader of opposition.
POI is only in the chat. When NATO bombed Belgrade, innocent people died, and that was a tragedy. But it was the right call because it stopped a genocide of the Kosovar people by the Serbian government. We think that broadly, offense is the best defense, and it leads to conflicts ending quickly with fewer people dying. That is the simple path to victory from opening opposition. First, a piece of framing. Even though these conflicts are asymmetric in favor against the smaller nation, the US military might is so superior that it can overcome the enemy. Why is this the case? Because Western nations have the most military spending together combined than all nations, because NATO is a big bloc of the European nations, which are extremely rich, and the US, which is the largest economy in the world, and the fraction of military spending is quite large. But note that private manufacturers also invest in Western militaries because they see a continuous stream of conflicts and they lobby the US government to do this again and again, which is why we have a lot of investment into research and development for the best and most superior technology. Note that technological development is cumulative. That is to say, when you make one breakthrough, then you can build upon that breakthrough to make technology that's even better, which is why even a 10-year gap in development can lead to equipment that can completely overpower the equipment of the enemy of the enemy side. This is particularly important because most of modern warfare isn't like in World War I and II, where you have two people in trenches shooting at each other. You have guerrilla groups who are hiding in buildings and things like that. And when you have AI drones that can find people and just shoot them down, this allows the country to win the war, even if it has fewer men, and to achieve their military objectives. Why is this then extremely important? Firstly, because the defense that opening government wants to provide is ineffective. Why is this the case? Because let's take them at their best. You're defending your land, but you're still continually bled for resources. You have to spend your own government budget and the budget of Western nations who fund you, like it's happening in Ukraine right now. But notice, your people, the soldiers who are expendable, unlike technology, are dying again and again. Sure, OG might mitigate the number of people who are dying, but the enemy keeps attacking you, even though you prolong the suffering. Why is this then the problem? Multiple fold. First of all, you seem weaker and have a lower negotiating position because you're not gaining any victories and because more of your people are dying. But secondly, we win on OG's point that you lose political support for funding the war because people get war fatigue in Western nation when the conflict is prolonged, where you just have a defense, but you're still sending your people to the meat grinder, like's happening in Ukraine right now. So we get less support. But notice that offense is the best defense in many cases and can aid you in your defense because offensive weapons are focused on mobility versus immobile defensive weapons. So anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons are only set up in some areas, whereas offensive weapons are like trucks and like special weapons that allow you to strike something at a larger distance. Why is this extremely important? Firstly, you can attack military bases and warehouses from which the enemy is supplying weapons by which they attack you. So you can attack their base before they attack you in the first place. You can just bomb, like you can drop a bomb at the place where when they're stockpiling or manufacturing the weapons and things like that. But importantly still, you can defend yourself from surprise attacks because you have to build a point of defense. You have to build rocket launchers in a certain place. When the enemy attacks a place where you didn't expect, like Ukrainians did not expect that Kyiv would be attacked, now you can move your weapons more quickly there. More importantly, however, you can reclaim strategically important areas. For example, if the enemy has control of a nearby port, if you can go in there and take back the port, then supplies can come easier from Western nations to you. This is important because this debate is not about heavy prioritization, it's just about prioritization. So if we're better at moving back the offensive, then the defensive weaponry that's coming in is easier to implement. So the defense is better on side opposition, so we actually win on this clash. Before I move on to the next argument, I'm happy to take a POI from closing. No? Okay, let me move on. Why you can end the war more quickly, and notice that the previous argument was the worst case scenario, but let's be optimistic because the West did end some conflicts and we can end more conflicts like this. Now you can attack important targets inside the enemy territory. This includes military generals who are important for morale and strategic missions because they are the head of the operation, they have all the data and stuff like that. Important targets. You can attack military bases of operations from which they execute different things. When you attack this is a disorienting effect because if you lose one unit, then another unit does not work as effectively because they're synergetic, right? And as I mentioned before, you can attack warehouses and sources of resources. This leads to quicker negotiations because what OG says is, you'll have better negotiations if you pretend to be a peacekeeping pussy. This is bullshit. We live in real politic times. No one is friends in politics. It's all about power, right? So if you have more leverage, if you have more land, then people listen to you more. The places where we have more geopolitical conflicts is during the Biden era because Biden seems weak and he does not, it has nothing. It has a lukewarm support for Ukraine. You need to show teeth. Why then will negotiation be quicker? Firstly, sometimes you just win because the military pressure is so powerful, like it did happen with Kosovo. We literally stopped a genocide. Secondly, you can have better negotiations because you have more internal support within the defending country to end the war. Right now, Ukrainians don't want to end the war. But if we capture Kyiv again, then more Ukrainians might want to end the war. Then Zelensky might want to negotiate. So this party wants to negotiate more. But crucially, the other party wants to negotiate now as well. Because if they don't negotiate now, in the future, they'll be in a weaker position. Sure, Putin wants to present himself as the victor, but if he can predict he'll be in an even weaker position like a year or two, he has to take his wins now and gaslight the public. Oh, at least they did not take all of our areas. They only took 3 of our areas. So the other party is more likely to concede as well, winning on OG's metric. Finally, this is a great deterrence for the future because once other countries know that you'll go into their territories, you're going to do the following stuff. Destroy infrastructure inside the countries, like building, and this is going to be seen in media. This is deeply traumatic for people. Some civilians might die, which means in the future, nations don't want to fuck with you. The war in Ukraine right now for most Russians is distant for most civilians. It's only something they see in the media. They're not dying. But if you see a harm within your country, then other nations in the future will know we will not mess around. This is why Serbia right now is not invading Republika Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Serbia because Serbia knows that the last time it fucked around, it found out. And that's why I'm very happy to win from opening opposition.
Thank you so much for this fine speech. Now I'd like to invite DPM.
Cool, just a second. Theo in the chat, please. Two observations on the LO before I start. The first is the debate is about heavy prioritization. Please read the motion if you're going to be in an open semi-final of the Euros prep competition. 2, Serbia never forgave the West, and innocent people died because, I would say fruitlessly, because I would say the cost of genocide was likely to end anyway due to severe economic sanctions that were being put on Serbia as a result of this, due to severe political pressures, because it was not popular among all Serbs that they were killing this many people, and due to the fact that information had gotten out about this to the extent that NATO decided to bomb Serbia. What happened uniquely was that about 1,000 civilians died unnecessarily, and infrastructure was destroyed in a way it still is today. We think those are harms. We also think if you'd been able to defend the cause for Muslims, that would have been better. There was not a clear trade-off in that particular example that you could have done defensive versus offensive. And crucially, the fact they only have one example would actually indicate they don't really have a case that applies in many other conflicts. Let's engage with the rest. They say even if, even if they're the smaller side of the war, the US military or NATO have much more funding and much more capacity to win a war with what they have. Panel, this is like purely crazy. I'm sorry, it is. There is no incentive for the US or NATO to get directly involved. And I would note empirically, they don't anymore. They don't get involved. They don't start attacking the greater power for the greater good. Like, this is not something that happens in 2024. It's something that happened recently. Here's a couple of reasons for this. One, it means making an enemy of the stronger power, a state which still might win that conflict. It's explicitly making an enemy of them if you start giving offensive weaponry to a country that is intended to attack them. Defensive weaponry can always be framed through the lens of we are trying to protect people from dying. And I would note the crucial importance of this, right, is that obviously states' relationships with other states is quite nuanced. It's not just true that you get angry at a country and then you stop engaging with them entirely. What is true is that, the US still engages with Russia on a number of trade things, even though they criticize Russia on many things. They still engage with Russia in a number of diplomacy measures because they still have to, because the two of them are two quite powerful states in global diplomacy in general. The difference, though, is that what happens if they start giving offensive weaponry to Ukraine is that makes Russia absolutely furious, and I just think they are far less likely to engage in whatever beneficial economic trade they're engaging in now in their other endeavors or whatever other diplomacy measures they're doing. And that usually has other impacts, right? Because states work together in other things, be it peacekeeping things in Afghanistan or in Syria, or just in economic things that are beneficial to states in general. So all of that means there's potentially high cost to pissing off the state in that way if they decide to cut you off from the other levers that you were connected in. I don't think Western states are willing to make that trade-off. But secondly, it is just highly unpopular back home. Think about the body bag effect, right? People do not like it when their sons come home in body bags, especially for conflicts which they don't feel any obligation toward. Defensive weaponry is always going to be framed to your people through the lens of we are helping them stop people from dying. If what they're suggesting in opening opposition is because the US has so much money and so much military capacity, they could go win the war for Ukraine, that obviously is never going to happen. That's not going to change the likelihood. And even if they had the incentive to do this, you also have to prioritize your own people, to whom you have a much greater obligation because they are the ones who pay taxes to support the military budget in the first place. Which means even if the US and NATO have massive budgets, right, I just don't know why they would funnel so much more of it into offensive weaponry than defensive. Defensive is so much easier to sell, so you can do more of it. Offensive is both hard to sell, but also they still have to prioritize the people back home. Still have to prioritize peacekeeping missions the people have sent them offward. Still have to prioritize being able to support their own defense and deter other people from invading. All of which are things which require them to prioritize their own military, and therefore I don't think you get massive funding into offensive weapons. Fine. Next thing they say, obviously, is that offensive weaponry is good to end the conflict faster. Firstly, it's not true that this happens because it doesn't change the weaker state's capacity to win the war. Even if there are more offensive weapons in the hands of the weaker party, they're still significantly weaker. Firstly, often just trivially, size-wise, they are smaller countries. Often they're the smaller countries near large countries. And invasions usually happen because you think it's quite likely you're going to win, right? Which means that you usually believe that you were in a much better position against the other state to invade them. At this point, I think most of these weaker states are very small countries geographically and also population-wise relative to the others. Secondly, often militarily they are just far less well trained because these were mostly the invaded parties. And two observations on that would be, Firstly, they funneled a lot less of their money into the military because they didn't expect to be invaded. But secondly, they haven't trained their military for this exercise to the same degree because they were taken by surprise. If you take an example like Russia-Ukraine, that invasion we know was planned about like 8 years in advance, which is the Russian military had both money and also training funneled into their military in advance. Ukraine didn't, so they were taken by surprise and therefore always on the back foot militarily. They can have more weapons, but that doesn't mean their soldiers are better trained. It doesn't mean they have more money to get better armor and weapons to make their soldiers more likely to survive. I just don't think the weapons are going to be a tipping point. But thirdly, being able to attack more doesn't mean you will win the war. Even if in Ukraine they could bomb the fuck out of Moscow or out of a particular weapons center for a leader of opposition, it would not change the fact that Russian soldiers are still on the ground now in other parts. And it would not stop Russian soldiers from being able to bomb the fuck out of Lviv or hurt people in other parts of Ukraine. We think those people can be protected with defensive measures because Andy explained why they are so good at defending people, and that saves lives in general. Additionally, the aid stuff means people are more likely to stay alive also. And even if it does change the likelihood of ending the conflict, it angers the invading state far more if Western states are giving weapons for the sole purpose of attacking those states, because they themselves fear those things. They have self-defense. Basically, it overrides their other incentives because it's life or death for their citizens if you start bombing the invading state or the bigger states' cities as well. And they have an obligation to protect them, which is going to make them angrier and more destructive in the war to have a capacity they can and cut off Western states more. The effect of this is that they also seek out and get more offensive weaponry on their side, like from other parties. So I just don't think the war ends faster. I think if anything, it gets bloodier. Next thing I want to talk about is why I'll take the COPOI before going on.
Opening?
Okay, opening opposition has a speech, so I don't think it's particularly valid when they take their POI now. Why do we think the right to life is a prerequisite to all others and the most important? So just even if the war ends slower, if people have the defensive properties that mean the missiles and AI drones that the LO talks about are less likely to kill them in the cities where they live, we think it is good for them to stay alive for longer. Firstly, because the right to life is a prerequisite to all other rights. You have no choices, no agency, no pain, no pleasure, no human dignity if you're not alive to see it in the first instance. Secondly, I think just that we would prefer that, like, given all wars end with both sides sitting down and talking about how they're going to split up the things at the end, we'd rather people made it to the end of the war to survive. But secondly, recovery from war requires your infrastructure to still exist. In years in which you were rebuilding your state, the ability to have hospitals, the ability to have roads is all incredibly important, and you need those things to be able to get people their basic needs after the war ends. We think you are less likely to have those things destroyed if you have defensive weaponry to keep them alive generally. I want to have a quick extension why I think it's fine to sacrifice soldiers' lives for civilians, prioritize civilian welfare even over soldiers. Firstly, because soldiers consented to be soldiers. And like the natural response is, oh, it's coercive because they needed money or because of family pressure or whatever. But all choices are coercive, even if it's like your values, your families, the traits you're born with, the calls them to be made. The act of it being coercive can't in and of itself make it not a choice, especially if they otherwise would have chosen like prostitution, factory work, any other job, which is also coercive. The second thing I would note is it is informed in the sense we know that war is violent, and even if they conscript it, they always have the opportunity to defect, and like that is it's hard, but less hard than fighting in a war and dying. So I think it is possible for people to do that. For all of those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thanks so much for this nice speech. Now I'd like to invite the dialogue.
Before I start, I just want to say that for obvious reasons, as a Polish person, this hits a little bit closer to home than perhaps it hits in Ireland. So this speech might be a little bit more emotionally charged than we usually would see. But anyway, I'll begin on my first word. To think that cowardice in the face of disaster will save us from annihilation is pure insanity. The people who will deny the soldiers of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine the chance to actually defend themselves the way that they need to reclaim the territory that is necessary for the continuation of their struggle, to prevent genocidal dictators like Putin invading other countries, because we know that the West is going to come into aid and destroy the offending force as much as they can, is the necessary thing to A, stop future wars, but 2, stop the conflicts that are happening right now. Why is Ukraine losing right now? Because Ukraine is starved of cash and starved of the resources that they had because of the heavy prioritization of defense. It's hugely unpopular to support losing wars. Why is that the case? Because one, projection of strength. Politicians do not want to be associated with weakness. They want to be associated with conquering, with destroying, with winning. Why is that the case? Because one, there's a lot of men in those countries, and men have those kind of emotions because they are driven by testosterone. But two, even if you aren't a man, you realize that you are going to be pouring money into a lost struggle at the point where you are funding exclusively defensive weaponry. Why is that the case? Because at the point where we are signaling we have no hope of doing anything other than just protecting some lives, you are conceding defeat. You're consigning those people to die in the future, if not right now. What does this mean? It's leaving people behind in the long term, and it is perception of leaving people behind. This means three things. Number one, the deterrence just gets shot through the head because we are signaling as the West, we are not going to be sending you the offensive weapons. No, we can't. We are just going to send you the defensive systems so that when the tanks roll into your fucking capital, you're going to have something to maybe prevent the tank from rolling over a building. Maybe you're going to have like the little spiky thing to prevent the tank going through. This is not enough. This is not enough to deter a crazy dictatorial regime like Putin's Russia to destroy you, because they are going to just go around it. They are going to grind your defensive to a halt, and they're going to say, well, if they are just defending, if they are getting nothing to hurt us back, there's no repercussions for us to not go in. This means that this is, by the way, the reason why Ukraine happened in the first place, because we have shown cowardice, because we have shown cowardice in Afghanistan, because we have shown cowardice throughout the conflict in Ukraine, because since 2014, we have not sent Ukraine the guns that they needed to defend themselves from the invasion of Sevastopol, from the invasion of Donbass, from the war in the east that Ukraine has been going through since 2014, 2016, escalation number 1, 2022, escalation number 2. What this means is that we are shooting our deterrence through the foot because we are showing weakness on the international stage. We are showing that we are nothing but pushovers who are willing to do nothing else but just protect the people who are going to die anyway, just maybe a little bit later. The best case scenario from OG is that the war is going to be over at a certain point, whatever happens. But this is not the case, because authoritarian regimes against which we are fighting are not motivated the same way that democracies are. They are not going to they are not going to collapse into like unpopular war because they have total control over the resources. This means three things. First thing it means, those conflicts can continue indefinitely until the autocracy wins the war if it doesn't hurt the autocracy. Because at the point where the people are kept in the dark about what happens in the war, and this is the crucial thing, this is the crucial difference between autocracy and democracy. The Russian citizens are kept in the dark because they can be, because the media is never going to tell them, Russia Today is never going to tell them, actually, you know, we just lost 7 people in this attack, we just lost 10 people in this attack. But when the body bags with Russian soldiers start coming back, they know and they see. Because they understand this in a much more visceral way. Because the mothers see the bodies of their sons being killed by Ukrainian missiles, and they understand that it is time now to say no to further Putin insanity. This is the way that you actually destabilize those regimes, by killing Russians. The only way that you can destabilize a Russian regime is by killing enough of them that the despairing mothers of Russian sons are going to finally say no more of this insanity. What is the alternative? Russia continues to expand aggressively. Other countries that have authoritarian incentives continue to expand aggressively. If we show weakness in the face of annihilation, we're facing the same annihilation in Taiwan. We're facing the same annihilation in Kazakhstan. We're facing further expansion of the Russian and Chinese spheres of interest through violent means, because we have shown that we are not reliable enough to hurt them enough, to kill them enough, that we can actually protect our interests in the long run. It has 2 terrifying fucking implications. If we continue to show weakness, we're going to face more and more war, more and more terror, which is winning the most important clash of this debate. Agree with OG, the amount of people lost, the amount of lives lost is the most important thing. But the only way that you can protect lives in the long term is by deterring those regimes from starting another war. Because if we win in Ukraine, China knows. If we start funding offensive weapons to a democracy that is endangered by authoritarians, they know. They know that if they go to Kazakhstan, they will face the exact same thing. They will face the Kazakhstan military that is armed with ATACMs, ready to destroy their supply points, ready to kill their Russians, and ready to protect their people in the only way that matters, in a mobile way, in a way in which you can relocate, in which you can, at the same time, and this is, by the way, a key burden that Marta misattributes, because, again, I think that this is a little bit of a confusing thing, I admit, but the motion says this House would heavily prioritize. This puts a burden on you to heavily prioritize. Doesn't put the burden on us to heavily prioritize. We are in favor of prioritization of offense anyway, but we get still some level of funding of defensive weapons. We just don't believe that they are as important because, one, at the point where we have mobility to affect the course of war, we can do much more damage to the actual war machine and stop it for good, which means that our people aren't going to be bled up in the long term. The analogy that I want to think about here is a corpse of a person, like it's a body of a person who is still alive, but you are inflicting 1,000 tiny wounds until they bleed out. On our side of the house, we give that guy a gun and we tell him, go and kill the person who wants to bleed you out with a knife. Because the Western army, the Western military is a gun compared to a Russian military knife. I will explain why this is the case after I take from closing.
Yeah, why do you think Western democracies are going to pick the right side?
Oh my God, this is going to be a Palestine case. Okay, whatever. Listen, in situations in which an authoritarian regime, this is explicitly defined by the motion, authoritarian regime invades asymmetrically a democratic ally. Number one. Number two, West has good incentives because they are accountable to the people. At the point where Israel is being bombed by Biden and at the point where like Rafah is under invasion, the people pull the plug on this because they don't believe that further bloodshed down there is necessary because they don't believe that this is a good cause. What happens though, and again, I think that generally this is an entirely uncomparative case because it's outside of the frame of the debate, outside of the motion. This is a troll case. Going into the reason why West is so superior. Number one, because of the technological advancement that Robbie already told you. But two, because those weapons need to be operated by experts. You need to have someone who can actually operate that artillery in order to use it. This is why Russia, despite the fact that they have some high-level artillery, are unable to use it because they lack the experts who can, on the battlefield, adjust the flow of the trajectory of the bullets fast enough to actually do the proper damage that they need to do. Secondarily, because again, those, like many of those autocracies do not have the kind of supply chains that West has. The West has supply chains in the UK, in other countries of the West, which means that they can step up military protocol and military production much faster than the other countries can, because they will have to rely on fucking Iran and sending Shahed drones from Iran, which, believe me or not, UK has better weapons than fucking Shahed drones from Iran. So proud to win from opening opposition.
Thanks so much for this fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the member of government.
Before I get going, POIs verbally, please. I won't be looking at the chat, so interrupt me. I want to start with an extremely controversial statement, that Western democracies sometimes support the wrong side of a conflict. Really importantly here, the weaker side isn't necessarily the more moral one. They aren't necessarily immune from committing atrocities themselves. I think this works fine on the opening government framing that they're never the aggressor, though probably sometimes the military weaker side can be the aggressor, because oftentimes conflicts just don't have a clear aggressor and a non-aggressor, as in it's unclear exactly what the dynamic is there. And then even if you aren't the aggressor, even if you aren't the initiator of a conflict, you can still eventually commit war crimes on those who don't. Why do I think it is likely that Western countries sometimes support evil actors in asymmetric conflicts? I have three reasons. There are three distinct reasons. They aren't really that distinct. Often they really overlap, but this is debating, and oftentimes we structure things this way. First, overemphasis of ideology. That's that these Western democracies consider themselves as sort of global ideological police. The idea is to instill their own ideologies on the rest of the world. And the electoral priority is those ideologies and not on the proximate conditions that are happening on the ground, because it's really hard for people to actually figure out, and they don't care about them as much because they aren't as proximate. They don't know as much about them. This means that it's really common for these Western democracies to support the democratic side of a conflict just because they're democratic, or to support an independence movement just because it is an independence movement, regardless of the morality of that actual fight and regardless of the actual conditions that they instill on civilians. The second reason here is because of proxy wars. You have a big hegemonic enemy who you're trying to fight in some major way. So therefore, this is the way you do it. You don't want to fight them directly. So instead, you do it through like two little pawns in some area. So it looks like, I don't know, what happens in the Middle East now, but also like other times of history. I'll get to that in a second. And then the third reason is because of historical ties and alliance. As in, you don't support the moral actor. You just support the one that you had a historical tie to, because you have sort of a mutual benefit here. You want to actually have the idea that you're always going to support people who you historically agree with you historically have this type of connection with. I think these three reasons is enough to show that, look, even if they might theoretically have an idea that these Western democracies support the side that's more moral, they just don't care as much, and they care about these other three things just much more. What does this actually manifest as? How does this actually look? I think we can look to history for some really obvious examples of exactly this. That is, Western democracies support the smaller and less militarily strong country, and that militarily strong party is actually quite evil and does a lot of bad stuff. First consideration, America supporting South Vietnam against the militarily stronger communist North Vietnam. Notice this is a combination of two of my mechs earlier. First, ideology, communism versus democracy. And second, proxy war, I think the US versus the Soviets, that was pretty clear. We can see quite clearly historically here that South Vietnam used American offensive weaponry on northern civilians. They actively committed war crimes with those types of weapons. This looks like using chemical warfare on children in many of these types of cases. As in, just because it is the smaller country, the smaller military power here, they still actively oppressed those in the north in this battle with offensive military that was given them directly by a Western democracy. So this actor just now has an ability to actively commit these types of harms in a way they would never otherwise, because you can't weaponize, the missile defense system in the same way you can the ability to actually access chemical warfare itself. I'll take CO really quickly if they have something.
Proxy wars have two sides. That means that on your side, the less accountable actor is likely supporting the country that's already stronger. If that is the case, then why does that mean that we should not intervene in these cases?
I'm unclear why the less accountable actor will have this. Sometimes you can even have proxy wars between Western democracies. I'm unclear why this ever ends up being true. Also, I think the fact that maybe also there can be bad actions considered on both sides isn't sufficient here. As in, sure, but the point is that they were actively causing more harm by allowing one party to commit war crimes actively on the other. So I think we can show there are quite obviously, empirically, times where the strategy of the opposition in this debate enables war crimes on civilians. As in, we literally just enable the use of this offensive weaponry for reasons that everyone would consider necessarily immoral. Note here that there is no accountability, because it's a really significant harm for the Western democracy to admit fault in the first place, to say, actually, this was an error. We shouldn't have supported this group. They weren't as moral as we originally thought. That is just someone these countries very rarely do. And then second of all, those initial incentives that I mentioned just still exist. So once you're in there, you suffer some cost fallacy and you're well, we just have to stick it out now. This is exactly what happened in Vietnam for America. As in, when people did realize this was indeed evil, still America stayed in the war for years and years after that, because they put in so much power into these people, even though everybody recognized that the weaponry was being used for evil at that point, and there were massive protests all over America. But why is it actually just likely that these types of countries, these types of groups, even if they're smaller, will do this, even though empirically we know it to be true? First, because of existing historical cultural clashes, as in they view them as the necessary enemy, so therefore they're willing to commit war crimes on them with these offensive weaponry, even if you might otherwise view it bad. Second, because of propaganda created within your internally, and then thirdly, as retaliation, as in there's an ongoing conflict, and so in those types of circumstances, you're less likely to be concerned about these types of things. So therefore, if you get offensive weaponry and you can use it to enable some sort of tactical benefit for you, you're likely to commit war crimes with absolutely no concern and recklessly because of these types of reasons. I think the consequence here is just pretty clear. The impact out of CG is just quite obvious, that sometimes in these really dangerous situations where you're putting people who are existingly vulnerable, who are existingly in these types of conflicts, in the position where they now have the ability to actively have people on the other side use this offensive weaponry to attack civilians, to attack children, to attack innocent people on the other side in a way that is never possible on our side of the house, because you can't weaponize defensive weaponry in the same way. But a second extension from CG, that is, the top half assumes that the only concern here is a tactical one. But if some weaponry is inherently worse than others, then it probably makes sense to prioritize it. That's going to be the second part of this case. The defensive weaponry is superior. Note that there's no real tension in our case here, because even when the actor is bad, giving them defensive weaponry probably isn't that bad, as in defending a population is fine even if you're a bad actor. Two reasons the defensive weaponry is likely to be superior. First, on development. There's generally more investment into defensive weaponry, because first of all, from govs, it looks more from governments themselves, it looks more politically positive, as in it's easier to justify where you're spending so much of your tax bill on developing defensive weaponry as opposed to non-offensive stuff. But second, secondarily, you just also have like non-government organizations who are also doing that type of investment. As in, if they figure out that there's actually a type of weaponry that's really helpful defensively, they're more likely to invest into it. They won't do that if they're like a non-government organization, like motivated by the greater good for offensive stuff. So that means that there's just better technology on the defensive side of things. That's why there's like really complex missile defense systems, but like a lot of the massive missile systems still use like floppy disks in America. The second point on why defensive weaponry is generally superior is on expendability and disposability. That is, that oftentimes the offensive parts of this like have like ammunition and missiles that just go away after some point, whereas when you set up defensive systems, it can exist for a long period of time, therefore be reused again and again. The consequence is that the same investment on both sides of the house gets you better and more weaponry on our side, regardless of this tactical use, which I think ultimately just make us come under a lot of these points made by opening half teams. But clearly, vote CG. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the member of opposition.
Well, very first thing, I'd like to not be recorded. So if we can stop the recording and I can have confirmation of that, oh, and the live stream, that would be great. Is it stopped? Sure. Until then, I'll just do a quick presentation. Hi, everyone.
quite a lot of the ethnic cleansing and a lot of the atrocities that actually occurred there, in addition to US soldiers often helping and often participating. But like the fact that the US soldiers are on the ground is completely irrelevant to that. Okay, let's talk about closing opposition. Guys, I actually don't think that most wars end because you've killed enough people. I actually think that this is the minority of the way for wars to end, with a show of overwhelming force or with like people like having died enough, etc. Because I think that you're going to hit the limit of like enough people dying if that's the way that wars end on both sides of the house eventually. But I think that the way that wars are more likely to end is through economic reasons or through political reasons, right? I think that political reasons is like an anti-war leader gains power because citizens are displeased with the resource expenditure or the drafting of their sons or anything else, and then they realize that this is just not efficacious for them, and so they are no longer wanting to do this in the first place. Or alternatively, economic pressures. International governments threaten and enact sanctions which actively hurt you, and so you stop fighting. I don't think that most wars end with a clear win or a loss. And I think that most of the wars we're talking about are not going to end with a win or a loss. I think this is a problem with a lot of the debate, because a lot of the debate relies entirely on being able to enact a win or a loss on their side, right? I think that opening government says that you're going to be able to protect civilians and you're going to have a signaling effect and there's going to be more funding, which is like good stuff, right? I think that this probably is comparative within the debate. But then I think that opening opposition says stuff like, you're going to be able to have a signaling effect that means you're not going to mess with the West, and you're not going to like mess with Western-backed democracies. You're going to lose political support in the long term and through war fatigue and stuff like that. And so you're just going to be like slowly overpowered. But I think that the more time we have for these other pressures to kick in and these other pressures to influence the war to end in the first place is actually the most likely way to prevent us hitting that cap of civilian deaths. It means that people buy out of the war. I think that if we want people to minimize fatalities, which we probably want to minimize in war, and if we want to minimize particularly brutal fatalities, what we need to happen is we need other pressures to step in and kick this out. Because I think that offensive war capacity is honestly not going to be enough to stop an authoritarian dictator like Putin either. I think that Russian mothers seeing their sons sent home in body bags is happening under Ukraine's military capacity, even without the like added benefit of US military intervention. And I think that this is not enough, because most wars are not going to end because of that. They're going to end because of other secondary pressures. What's our case, just out of curiosity? Our case is pretty simple, that quite frequently, you are not going to have Western liberal democracies supporting the correct side in this war, which means we probably would prefer that they have less capacity to do things. Because regardless of whether the correct side or they're the incorrect side, I think that the capacity to do things that are harmful and negative exists to a much higher degree whenever you have offensive capacity, whenever you have the technology that Robbie wants to talk about, or whenever you have the ability to engage in chemical warfare, which you didn't have before. I think that the ability to target citizens is unique to a higher capacity of offensive weaponry. I think that this would never happen because Western liberal democracies aren't stupid, but this is a useful thought experiment. Having nuclear capacity means that you have a higher capacity to target civilians and a higher capacity to like believe that you can end the war through shows of force. But I actually don't think these shows of force are going to end the war. I think that whenever your civilians die, you don't go, okay, time to go home now. I think that whenever your civilians die in like brutal ways that are enabled by the West, you are not only more anti-Western than you were before, but you're also more oppositional and more likely to continue the war. I think you still have to wait for the economic or political factors to kick in before anyone is going to stop fighting. Maybe there's a civilian cap, but I just don't think that's proven, and I don't think it's realistically true. Okay, what is opening opposition's case? I think what opening opposition tells you is that you're going to lose political support by the long term through war fatigue. I think that motives are, you have less investment whenever, I just don't think this is true. I don't think that you are able to enact the same amount of things. With the same amount of money, you have less bang for your buck with offensive weaponry, which means that you hit the point of war fatigue faster there, because it's not a time scale thing, it's a money scale thing. The US gets annoyed whenever we're like, we've sent $200 billion to Ukraine. They don't get annoyed whenever they're like, we've been sending defensive weaponry to Ukraine for the past 7 years. I think that they get annoyed whenever these kinds of things feel like they are unique disproportionate financially, which offensive weaponry is more likely to be, for the reasons that Cyrus tells you, which is why the stuff that Cyrus tells you about defensive weaponry being better is actively important. Because if it's cheaper, then it means that we can give them more of it, which means that we're, again, getting more bang for our buck, which is just a good thing. But it also just means that you're able to engage better with these wars whenever you have like more of an impact. And it means that you're able to justify the decisions you're making to your citizens to a much higher degree than whenever you feel as though all of your money has been thrown down the drain. I just don't think that that works. Then they say you have quicker negotiations. because leverage is essential. This is like reliant on them being the tipping point to actually being able to enact change in the war in the first place. I don't think US military capacity and what we're willing to send as foreign aid is the tipping point. And the reason I don't think that is because offensive weaponry is so expensive that you're unable to get the initial investment that is so high that you are able to overwhelm. Technological capacity is probably true. Technical capacity is completely outside of this debate because you can't send technology specialists over within the like weaponry thing, as closing opposition wants to point out. I'll take opening.
When you can reclaim important ports, destroy weapons stockpiles, and kill important generals, then the enemy doesn't have the capacity to slaughter civilians. We are logically prior to the gov bench impact. Sanctions don't work, by the way.
Okay, so whenever you can like do all of these like removal things, then you're able to like cause people to respond. But the thing is, one, I think that offensive weaponry capacity is not unique to the US providing you this offensive weaponry capacity. I think that it's fine if these smaller countries do the military capacity that's offensive themselves. But I think it's uniquely bad whenever we allow Western weapons, which you've characterized as much, much worse, to be weaponized against civilians. You say that like they're not going to be able to, like the aggressor is not going to be able to target civilians if these things happen successfully. But my point is the smaller country is going to be able to target civilians. I think that that's a pretty terrible impact, and I think that's an impact that should be weighed pretty highly in the round. The case from closing government is pretty simple. There are a lot of countries in conflicts in which it's unclear who is the correct side initially, right? It's unclear who's the correct side even as it goes on. It's unclear who is more likely to take ideological steps, who is more likely to do things like ethnic cleansing. And whenever you have Western liberal democracies actively prioritizing offensive weaponry over defensive weaponry, you have more of a risk of intensely harmful ethnic cleansings occurring. You have more of a risk of war crimes occurring, and I'm just not willing to take that risk.
Thanks so much for this nice speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition whip.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Perfect. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with every other team in this debate is that nobody actually characterizes the incentives of these countries that are going to war in the first place. We specifically told you two things. First, the big countries are more likely to want things like wars of attrition. First of all, because they have more resources and more money, which means that they're more able to do things like buy guns and ammunition, which means that on their side of the house, if a war of attrition happens, these countries are more likely to win. The smaller countries are more likely to run out of ammunition or not be able to afford it. But secondly, the fact that these countries are stronger to begin with likely suggests that they had more resources and better economic strength in the first place. This A means that they're more able to weather sanctions, but secondly, it means that they're more able to do things like buy weapons and they're more resilient in the event of a war. The implication of this is that every single characterization of the war that is likely to occur by side government is exactly what these countries want in the first place. They want a long drawn out war where their numerical and resource advantage is likely going to take them over the edge. But secondly, on weaker countries, first of all, note that they do not have any of these advantages, which means that they're likely to want to end the war as quick as possible before all of their disadvantages start kicking in. But secondly, the fact that their territory is likely to be smaller just means that it is easier to lose the war, because if you lose one factory, you're probably going to be screwed. But third, the fact that Öcalan tells you that defense here is likely not satisfactory. The reason as to why is because the origins of these types of conflict, where it's a big country versus a small country or a strong country versus a weak country, is likely due to the fact that there was some level of aggression from the big country initially because they were the ones that had the capability to go to war to begin with. That's incredibly important, because even if defense is way more effective, we would say that these small countries are not likely to want that type of defense in the first place, because their goal was not to end the war specifically. Their goal was to regain the territory that they lost. That is why they want offense. Two paths to victory then for closing a government. The first is on aggression on the part of weak countries. They take side government at their highest ground, because yes, maybe it is the case according to CO that maybe these conflicts are complex, that there oftentimes isn't one country that is right or wrong. First of all, this means that it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to say that Western countries are likely to support the wrong actor, because in many cases, the wrong actor is probably very unclear. But secondly, if the Western countries are going to support the wrong actor, on their side, it gets worse. The reason why is twofold. First, because absent offensive weapons, i.e. the capability to attack from your from that is sold to you from your allies, that is a point in which you're likely to be far more scared. That is the point in which you're more likely to do things like launch brutal attacks on civilians because you want to end the war as fast as possible and you want to create the deterrent effect that OO talks about. Note that this flips the OG claim about civilian deaths. We agree that civilian deaths are incredibly bad, but on their side of the house, these countries are more likely to attack civilians at the point in which they think that they have no other option. But secondly, because you're likely to invest or buy weapons from worse actors. For example, India, which has far less accurate weapons, which means that even if you do not intend to kill more civilians, you're likely to do so because you don't have Lockheed Martin's advanced targeting technology for your drones, which causes more collateral damage, which then causes the war to escalate even more. How does this compare against all of the other teams? First, against CG, if their metric is that we're likely to support bad actors, first, I'm unsure as to how likely this is, but secondly, even if it is the case, bad actors get worse on their side. Secondly, against OO, I already proved to why civilian deaths are worse on their side. But lastly, against OG, but lastly, against OO, because let's face it, CO is probably right that Ukraine might be a very fringe case, but in many cases, it's unclear of which side is better. On that ground, we think that all actors are likely to be more escalatory on their side of the house, not just the one that was aggressive initially. The second path to victory, then, is that these stronger countries are more likely to negotiate on our side of the house. On our side, you have a greater capacity for these smaller countries to win battles in the first place. And note that this isn't tense with the other paths to victory, because even if the smaller country is likely to kill more people or kill more civilians, the result from the bigger country is that they escalate rather than they step down. What is likely on our side? First, when you're able to win more battles in the first place, that increases things like confidence of your own soldiers. And I just want to weigh why confidence is more important than things like the effectiveness of your weapons and your specific battle tactics, because I think those things are largely incredibly symmetric. However, if your troops are confident in the first place, if your troops think that they're going to win, that is the point in which you're likely to fight far harder. That is the point in which you're likely to take advantage of all of the advantages that we have on our side of the house, and that is why the worst defeats in Ukraine happened when the Ukrainian troops started losing hope their allies were not going to protect them anymore. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Your impacts require huge amounts of weapons to cause coups, defections, deterrence, or victory. Given neither op team proves this, OG wins on survival, recovery, and aid.
Our argument is not just that you cause more defections on our side and that causes these countries to suddenly stop fighting 100%. However, we think that the capability and the incentive for them to fight decreases dramatically, so we're happy to side on that scalar impact here. The second thing under this, though, is that we told you that you're likely to be able to attack things that are important to the attacking country. That is when your military specifically refuses to fight because they're taking too many casualties. When the elites in the country are say enough is enough because the factories and the industries that they own are being bombed, that is the point in which authoritarian countries even are likely to de-escalate. How does this position against the other material? First, against OG, note that their only link here to negotiation specifically is this argument about signaling, but that doesn't work. First, because note that if your argument is largely perceptual, defensive weapons still kill people because in order to stop a tank, anti-tank missile explodes the tank. But secondly, because like the allies that you're likely to have, the Western countries are likely to have are far less likely to negotiate on their side of the house at the point in which they don't think their allies are supporting them. Weigh this over their arguments about the attacking country negotiating, because we likely do not have a lot of leverage over them, especially because if CO's characterization about proxy wars is correct, they're likely being supported by other actors like Russia, China, or Iran. That means that the most important thing for negotiations is the fact that our allies are actually able to be supported and have confidence in us. If that leverage goes away, then all of our leverage goes away. But secondly, why does it weigh against CG? Because we would say that military success makes sanctions more effective. On their side, soldiers keep fighting despite sanctions. However, on our side, you're able to ensure that countries cannot prepare for sanctions, and also countries are just likely to prepare for sanctions in the event of before they're going to attack. So we would say we create some actual level of collateral damage. But lastly, against OO, because the mechanism here is just that people are mad when war happens and people die. We were more specific in saying that the people whose decisions actually matter are far more likely to be impacted. We weigh over every other team because we're the only side that actually analyzes the incentives behind why countries go to war in the first place. Never been more proud to stand on closing government.